There wasn't a single moment I could point to as the exact beginning of the change. It wasn't an argument or a confession. It was a slow, almost invisible shift, one I only recognized in hindsight. It was a Tuesday evening in late March. I got home later than usual after finishing an emergency HVAC job. Normally, I'd smell dinner from the driveway and hear music playing from the kitchen. That night, the air in the house felt still. Takeout containers sat on the counter. In the distance, I could hear her voice through the bedroom door, low and fast, the way people speak when they don't want to be overheard. When she finally emerged, she looked faintly startled, as if my presence was unexpected. 8 o'clock, apparently, counted as early now. There was a faint color in her cheeks, a brightness in her eyes that had nothing to do with me. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice other things. Her phone, once left on the kitchen table, was now always in her hand or tucked into a pocket, the screen angled away from me. The late nights at the office became more frequent. Saturday outings with friends grew vague in detail. Whenever I asked, the answers were too smooth, too quick, and strangely incomplete. For a while, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe stress, maybe a need for more space. But there was a new chill in the way we moved around each other, a gap that had quietly opened and was widening by the day. The first real crack came on a Friday night. Her phone was on the coffee table, screen lighting up in the dim room. The preview was only a handful of words, but they landed like a blow. Can't stop thinking about last time. By the time she noticed I'd seen it, the device was already in her hand, face turned away. No explanation could change the fact that I had just glimpsed the truth, not in her words, but in the way she shielded them. From that moment on, I stopped looking for comfort and started looking for proof. Once the possibility lodged itself in my mind, I began to see the small fractures everywhere. They weren't loud, they didn't demand attention, but they were there. The shift in her scent when she came home late. Not perfume I recognized, something lighter, sharper. The way she'd stand in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone with the faintest smile, the kind you give when someone says something just for you. The new clothes that appeared without tags, not part of any shopping trip I knew about. I didn't mention any of it. Confrontation felt premature. This wasn't about emotion anymore. It was about clarity, and clarity required patience. So, I started noting patterns. Which nights she claimed to be working late. Which Saturdays she went out with the girls. Which mornings she seemed more energized than usual, despite claiming she'd been up late watching TV alone. I began paying attention to the clock when she was gone. Her late nights at the office always ended around the same time, just before 10. The Saturday outings never stretched past midnight. There was a rhythm to it, and rhythms have explanations, if you follow them long enough. One evening, while she was in the shower, I noticed her handbag resting open on the dresser. Inside, her phone was face down, the corner of a receipt peeking out from the side pocket. I didn't touch it, but I could see the logo printed in bold letters, a wine bar in the city. She had told me she'd been at a friend's apartment that night. That was the moment I stopped doubting myself. The air between us wasn't just cold, it was carrying the weight of something concealed. And whatever it was, it didn't belong to our marriage. I didn't act yet. I simply kept watching. Because when the truth finally came into view, I wanted it whole, not in pieces. The next step wasn't an impulse. It was a decision made in the quiet of the early morning when the house was still and my mind was clear. I began with her calendar. Not the one on the wall, but the invisible one she carried in her routines. I knew which evenings were late at the office and which Saturdays were girls' nights. I didn't confront her about them. Instead, I marked them down, building a record. Her patterns were precise, almost mechanical. Tuesdays and Thursdays for the late nights, second and fourth Saturdays for the outings. It was the kind of consistency you don't get from chaos. It comes from planning. I kept track of the small coincidences. How the scent of unfamiliar cologne seemed to linger in the car's interior after certain evenings. How her phone calls became shorter when I walked into the room, her voice flattening into something casual. how she'd change into different clothes before going out, leaving the ones she wore earlier folded neatly on the bed. By the end of the third week, the map in my mind was almost complete. The timings lined up too neatly. The locations she claimed to be at never matched the type of receipts she left behind. One night, she returned home just after 10, the faint scent of wine following her into the hallway. She set her bag down and walked into the kitchen, humming to herself. I noticed a smudge of lipstick on her wrist, like she'd brushed against someone or someone while leaning close. I didn't say a word. I simply added it to the growing file in my head. The truth wasn't far now. I could feel it. And when I finally reached it, I wanted it to be undeniable. The decision to move from observation to action came quietly. It wasn't anger that pushed me forward. It was the steady certainty that the patterns I'd been tracking weren't coincidences. I started simple. The next time she announced a late night at the office, I left work early. Instead of going home, I parked a few blocks from her building. From my spot, I could see the glass doors of the lobby. She didn't come out at her usual quitting time, nor an hour after. But at 8:12, she appeared, not in her work clothes, but in a different outfit entirely. Jeans, a light jacket, hair down. She didn't walk toward the parking garage. Instead, she turned the opposite way, heading toward the busier streets. I let her get ahead, then followed from a distance. She moved quickly, weaving through side streets until she reached a small corner restaurant. Warm light spilled from the windows. I stayed far enough back to avoid being seen, but close enough to watch her greet someone waiting at a table by the window. It wasn't just a friendly meeting. The lean across the table, the subtle touch of her hand over his, it was an intimacy you don't share with a coworker or a casual acquaintance. I didn't take photos that night. It wasn't time yet. This was reconnaissance, nothing more. Proof would come later. When she finally left, just before 10, she walked with him part of the way down the block before they separated. She didn't notice me as she passed my car on her way to the garage. That night, lying in bed beside her, I felt the space between us more sharply than ever. It wasn't just emotional anymore. It was physical, solid, and cold. I knew where she was going now. Next time, I'd be ready to catch it. Knowing where she went was one thing. Proving it was another. Over the next week, I replayed that night in my head, not because I wanted to torture myself with the image of her leaning across the table, but because I needed to understand the mechanics of it, the route she took, the timing, the small habits that could be predicted and used. The first step was to narrow down her range. That restaurant wasn't somewhere she just stumbled into. It was deliberate. It sat on a quieter street, tucked between a tailor shop and a dimly lit bookstore, the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. The windows were high enough to give the people inside a sense of privacy, but low enough for someone outside to see, if they knew where to stand. I drove past it twice during the day, taking in the layout, the angles. Across the street was a recessed doorway belonging to a closed-down cafe. Dark glass, deep shadows, the perfect place to wait unnoticed. The second step was timing. Her late nights were still reliably on Tuesdays and Thursdays. If the pattern held, it wouldn't take more than 2 stakeouts to catch her meeting him again. And when it happened, I'd be in position, not just watching, but recording. I went over my tools. My phone camera was decent, but I needed something steadier, something that could capture details without drawing attention. I bought a compact camera with a long lens, small enough to fit in a jacket pocket, and tested it in my driveway under low light. In those quiet nights at home, while she sat in the living room watching a show with her earbuds in, I sat in the kitchen, scrolling through my preparations, committing the plan to memory. She thought my silence was disinterest. In reality, I was counting down the hours. It was strange. There was no adrenaline, no rush of nervous energy. It felt more like waiting for a storm I knew was coming, the kind where the clouds have been gathering for days and the air is too still. When the storm finally broke, I wanted to be standing exactly where it hit. It was a Thursday when everything lined up.
She came into the kitchen after her shower, hair still damp, blouse neatly pressed, perfume faint but deliberate. The announcement was casual. She'd be working late, might grab something light on the way home. She said it while looking into the fridge, not at me. That was her tell now, avoiding my eyes when she lied. I nodded without comment, the way I had trained myself to. The less I reacted, the more she felt in control. And the more she felt in control, the more predictable she became. By 7 o'clock, I was parked 2 blocks from the restaurant, camera in my lap, windows cracked just enough to let in the cool night air. Streetlights painted long, amber lines across the pavement. The city at that hour was a mix of sounds: distant traffic hum, the occasional laughter spilling from a bar, the sharp clink of silverware from nearby patios. At 8:09, she appeared. Same jacket as before, same jeans, same quiet urgency in her walk. She moved like someone late to something that mattered. I let her get halfway down the street before slipping out of the car, keeping her in sight but never close enough to catch her glance. She didn't hesitate at the restaurant door. Inside, the lighting was warm, soft, and low. It framed her face when she smiled at the man already seated at the corner table, the same man I'd seen before. He stood to greet her, his hand brushing her waist in a way that wasn't friendly. She didn't flinch, she leaned into it. I took the first photo from across the street, grainy but clear enough to see the outline of his hand against her side. The second photo was closer, from the recessed doorway I'd scouted. They were leaning toward each other, forearms resting on the table, her expression lit with the kind of attention she hadn't shown me in months. The third photo, that was the one I knew would end everything. He reached across the table, fingers curling around hers, and she let him. I stayed there for nearly an hour, capturing moments, shared smiles, touches that lingered, a toast over glasses of red wine. Each image felt like a brick being laid in the wall between us. When they left, they walked side by side for half a block before he turned down another street. She stood there for a moment watching him go, before heading toward the parking garage. By the time she was home, I was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open. She breezed in, dropped her bag, and mentioned something about a late meeting. I didn't respond. Not yet. That night, I copied the photos to 3 different drives, labeled and dated. I didn't look at them again before bed. I didn't need to. They were burned into my mind, frame by frame. By morning, the images were no longer just proof. They were a decision waiting to be made. Every time I opened my laptop, the folder sat there like an unopened letter, heavy with meaning. I didn't need to click it. I knew it was inside.
The strange thing was, I felt no urge to confront her immediately. The old version of me, the man from 6 months ago, might have stormed into the living room, demanded explanations, raised his voice. But that man had been eroded by months of quiet distance, late nights, and unanswered questions. What replaced him was something colder, more deliberate. I spent the next 2 days in a kind of stillness, moving through my routines with an awareness I hadn't had before. Every interaction with her felt staged now, as if we were both reading from a script neither of us believed in. She would mention work, or friends, or errands, and I would nod. No challenge, no disbelief shown. Let her think the performance was working. At night, I lay awake beside her, listening to the rhythm of her breathing. It was steady, calm. I wondered if she knew the end was already in motion, or if she truly believed she was safe. I considered my options. I could confront her privately, lay the photos on the table, and watch the color drain from her face. That would be clean, controlled. Or I could let the truth spill into the light in a more public way, perhaps in front of a friend or her family, where lies would collapse under witness. That would be final. But the longer I thought, the more I realized my priority wasn't drama, it was certainty. I didn't want her walking away with half-truths, telling a softer version of the story to save her image. I wanted a record so clear that even she couldn't twist it into something else. The plan began to take shape. It would start with the evidence, then the lawyer, then her absence from my life. The marriage, as I had known it, was already gone. Now, it was only a matter of removing what was left of her from the space we shared. It was a Sunday evening when I decided to do it. The weekend had been unremarkable: quiet errands, separate rooms, the kind of detached coexistence that had become our norm. She was at the dining table, scrolling through her phone, legs crossed, coffee cooling beside her. I walked in with my laptop under my arm and sat across from her. The screen was already open, to the folder. No small talk, no lead-in. I turned the laptop toward her. The first photo appeared, her leaning forward in that dim restaurant, hand brushing against his. She looked at it for a second, eyes narrowing, as if she was trying to place the image. I clicked to the next, his hand over hers. Then the next, their glasses raised in a toast, both smiling in a way I hadn't seen from her in months. Her shoulders stiffened. She set the phone down slowly, but her eyes didn't meet mine. There was a pause, the kind that feels longer than it is. "I followed you twice," I said evenly. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. She still nothing from her. Not a word. "I'm not asking for an explanation," I continued. "I don't want to hear how it's not what it looks like. I know exactly what it is." Her hands folded together in front of her, fingers knotting and unknotting. She started to speak, but I raised a hand slightly, not to silence her, but to make it clear I wasn't interested in a defense. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," I said. "You'll be hearing from them this week. Until then, you can stay here or go. That's your choice. But this marriage is over." There was a flicker of something in her eyes, anger maybe, or fear, but it was gone as quickly as it came. I closed the laptop, stood up, and left the table. Behind me, the chair creaked as she shifted, but she didn't follow. In that moment, the house felt both emptier and more mine than it had been in years. After the table scene, the house fell into a strange kind of silence. Not the easy quiet of two people reading in different rooms, but the heavy, airless quiet of something broken between us, neither of us willing to touch it. She moved differently now, slower, more deliberate. In the mornings, I'd hear her footsteps in the hallway, the sound of her coffee mug being set down just a little too firmly on the counter. She no longer tried to fill the space with small talk. There were no questions about my day, no passing comments about errands or weather. I went about my routines without adjusting for her presence. If she was in the kitchen, I cooked around her. If she was on the couch, I passed through without a word. It wasn't a conscious act of avoidance, just the natural rhythm of two people no longer orbiting each other. In the evenings, I noticed her spending more time in the bedroom with the door half closed. Sometimes I'd hear her on the phone, her voice hushed, though never enough to disguise the fact that she was trying to make plans. Whether those plans with him or someone else didn't matter anymore. The part of me that used to care was gone. The photos remained in the folder on my laptop, untouched. I didn't need to revisit them. They'd served their purpose. They were the clean line between before and after. Oddly enough, the days began to feel lighter. Not joyful, not yet, but lighter. Without the constant second-guessing, the weight in my chest was loosening. I no longer scan her words for hidden meanings or watch her body language for signs of deceit. The truth was already on the table. All that was left was the paperwork and the logistics of dismantling a shared life. I caught myself one evening, standing in the driveway, just breathing in the cool night air, realizing I hadn't thought about her whereabouts in hours. That kind of peace, even in small doses, felt like a preview of what was waiting for me on the other side of this. She must have felt the shift too. There was a look in her eyes when we passed each other. Not guilt, not even shame, but the recognition that she had lost any power she once held over me. That, more than anything, told me I was already free.
The appointment with my lawyer was set for a Thursday afternoon. I arrived 10 minutes early, not out of eagerness, but because I didn't want to be rushed through something that would determine how the rest of this process unfolded. The office was quiet, the air faintly smelling of old books and fresh coffee. My lawyer, a calm, deliberate man in his 50s, listened without interrupting as I laid out the timeline. I told him about the late nights, the bar receipt, the stakeout, the photographs. His only reaction was a slow nod, as if each detail was a tile fitting into place. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and told me it was straightforward. "With what you have," he said, "there's no room for dispute. We can file for divorce citing infidelity and be done with it quickly, provided she doesn't try to fight over assets." I agreed to everything he suggested: formal notice, division of property, her removal from the joint accounts. We drafted the paperwork that same day. Back at the house, I didn't announce what I'd done. Instead, I began the quieter work of reclaiming the space. Her shoes by the door were the first to go, placed in a box in the hall closet. The decorative throw pillows she'd bought, the ones that never felt like mine, were stacked in a corner. Even the scent of her perfume, still faint in the bedroom, began to fade as I aired out the space. The house looked different without her touches. Colder, maybe. But it also felt cleaner, less like a stage set for a life we weren't living anymore. That night, I made dinner for one, eating at the kitchen table without the hum of a television in the background. The quiet was different now, less suffocating, more like an empty canvas. When the paperwork arrived for her to sign, I left the envelope on the table. No note, no explanation, just a simple, silent offering of the next step toward separation. She saw it the next morning. Her hand lingered on the envelope for a moment before she picked it up and carried it into the bedroom. I didn't follow. I didn't need to hear her reaction. The decision was already written. It happened on a Saturday morning, just after sunrise. The light was soft through the blinds, the kind that makes the air look almost hazy. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee when I heard the sound of drawers opening and closing upstairs. There was no rush in her movements, no frantic energy, just the steady rhythm of someone collecting what mattered to them. A suitcase rolled softly against the hallway carpet. I didn't move. I stayed in my seat, listening as she made her way down the stairs. She appeared in the doorway with the same neutral expression she'd worn for weeks. The envelope I'd left on the table was gone. In its place, a faint indent in the wood where it had rested. She didn't speak, and I didn't ask where she was going. There was no point. Words were unnecessary now. We had already said everything in the silence of the past few weeks. The sound of the front door opening was followed by the cool morning air drifting in for a brief moment. Then came the sharp click of it closing behind her. I stayed at the table until the sound of her car faded down the street. Only then did I walk to the front window. The driveway was empty, the space where her car had always been, now just a patch of sunlight creeping across the concrete. The house felt different immediately. Not lighter, not heavier, just stripped of something. The rooms seemed to hold their breath. I walked through them slowly, noticing the absence: the missing shoes by the door, the bare space on the dresser where her perfume bottles had stood, the closet half as full as it had been yesterday. I didn't feel relief, not yet. What I felt was a strange stillness, as if my life had been on a taut wire for months, and now it had gone slack. The marriage was over in practice long before the suitcase rolled out the door, but seeing her leave, knowing she wouldn't be coming back, was the line I'd been walking toward all along. The first week after she left passed like a slow tide, moving in and out without urgency. The silence in the house was no longer the brittle, uncomfortable kind. It was steady, almost grounding. I could hear the creak of the floorboards again, the wind against the windows, the hum of the refrigerator. All the small sounds that had been drowned out by tension were back, and I found myself noticing them like old friends I'd forgotten about. I didn't go looking for distractions. There was no sudden burst of social plans, no late nights trying to fill the space. I stayed with the quiet, letting it stretch out until it felt natural. The kitchen became my space again. The bed, once a place where I lay stiff and watchful, became just a bed. The paperwork moved forward without resistance.
She signed, I signed. Soon, it would be final in the eyes of the court. But in every way that mattered, it was already final. When people talk about betrayal, they usually focus on the moment of discovery, the text message, the photograph, the confession. But what I learned is that betrayal is a slow erosion. By the time you see the cracks, the foundation's already gone. I don't hate her. Hatred would keep her in my head, and I've got better things to do with my thoughts. What I feel is distance, the kind you don't cross again. If there's anything I'd tell someone going through this, it's this. Trust the small signs. You don't have to wait for the obvious proof to know something's wrong. Your instincts don't shout, they whisper. And if you ignore the whisper long enough, it becomes the silence you can't escape. Now, the silence in my life is mine. Not hers, not ours. Just mine. And I'm keeping it.